you have, of course, met with the Prime Minister one-on-one when he was in Australia, and he described you as somebody who's become quite a popular name in India. There it says, "Howdy Modi," and then the Prime Minister goes on to tweet that you have, of course, become a popular name in India. You also often find yourself at the heart of what has come to be known as India's democracy debates. So I think we're going to have an interesting conversation today, Salvatore. Let me start by asking you, what's the big takeaway for you as you look at what's happened in the United States? It's almost like two different narratives, what the government is saying and what spaces of the non-government are saying in America.
The biggest takeaway is that even the pro-India government narrative is not so pro-India. And I think that's something that Indians should be aware of. There's been an embrace of India.
Explain that.
Oh, sure. When Jake Sullivan, or for that matter, the U.S. National Security Advisor, or for that matter, when the president himself talked about questions about Indian democracy and human rights in India, the response was that this is something for India to work on, not something that we would lecture India about. And it almost seems like they're taking Dr. Jaishankar's talking notes on this, saying that they're essentially conceding the ground. They're saying that, well, there are all these activist concerns about India. We're not going to rebut them. Implicitly, they're accepting them. But we are going to say that it's none of our business. Now, I think a much more positive narrative would have been if anyone in leadership in the U.S., whether it's Congress or the Oval Office, if anyone in leadership in the U.S. had actually said, no, in fact, India scores well on human rights. No, in fact, we believe in Indian democracy. If they presented a positive message, I would have been much more impressed. But if you read carefully, if you parse what they're saying, they never endorse Indian democracy, except in the most general terms. India is the world's largest democracy. We two great democracies stand together. I mean, that generic language is there. But in terms of specifically endorsing liberalism in India, instead of specifically rebutting the accusations made against India, they're pretty much just saying it's not our business. And I think that is that's an unfortunate outcome here. There was an opportunity here for a real embrace, and instead there was almost well, don't ask us about that.
That's interesting. You're actually saying that given that the Biden administration did not actually come out and praise the record of India on human rights, on pluralism, on democracy, you believe it fell short of being completely pro-India.
Oh, yes. I mean, look, let's just look at some simple facts. All of the writing I've been doing the last few months about the status of Muslims in India, status of Christians in India, is all based on American data coming from the Pew Research Center, which is right there in Washington, D.C. I have never heard any of that data cited by a mainstream U.S. source. And in fact, my own op-eds attempting to pitch them to U.S. newspapers were all rejected. Now, Jake Sullivan and the president have access to the whole Central Intelligence Agency, this massive data gathering organization that's supposed to feed intelligence to the president with a daily briefing. Now, Joe Biden should be getting the briefing that American research, not Indian research, not the Indian government, American research shows that, well, for example, Muslims face a lower level of self-reported discrimination in India than any minority group in the United States, that Christians report a lower level of discrimination in India than any minority group in the United States. I mean, those kind of facts are things that should be foregrounded. I've been talking about them. I'm aware of them. They're out there in the public domain. Why are we hearing them being cited? Why don't we hear a specific rebuttal?
Okay, before we come to what the Americans could have done, there are also other statistics. For example, the BJP, arguably amongst the most powerful political parties in recent memory in India, does not have presently a single Muslim member of parliament in the Lok Sabha. Right? That's just a fact. And it has often underrepresented Muslims in ticket distribution. When it does give tickets, those candidates don't actually do well. There is rhetoric that is made by leaders who are seen to be close to the BJP that is patently anti-Muslim. So what I'm saying is that we can put that data out too, of the absence of Muslim representation, not a single Muslim BJP member of parliament in the Lok Sabha.
Oh, I'd love to see a debate based on facts. So I'd love to see a more specific debate where, okay, if not the president himself, certainly his national security advisor, certainly journalists at places like the Wall Street Journal, and we can talk about the Wall Street Journal at the news briefing yesterday. You know, these people should at least be saying in a more specific way, look, we have evidence that ordinary Muslims are very happy in India. And I'm sorry if that jars Indian audiences, but that's what the survey data tell us absolutely clearly. However, there seems to be a problem of Muslim representation. We'd love to see more work done about bringing Muslims into the mainstream of Indian society, which is also true. And this is something I've said right from the beginning. My very first headline performance in India, I stressed that there were very few Muslims in the audience. And why is that? Because Muslims are a socially excluded group in India, and more work needs to be done on the social inclusion of Muslims. Now, that is a much more detailed, specific, and a fairer narrative. It would be like telling the United States, we'd like to see more women in Congress. Well, we'd like to see more women in Congress is different from saying we're concerned about the human rights of women in America. Those are two very different narratives. And I think having a more fact-based discussion about India. Again, I'm not expecting Joe Biden personally to have this discussion, but I do expect his staff, I do expect especially journalists to be having this discussion, and we're just not seeing it. Instead, they're accepting this broad view that India violates human rights, but there are human rights violators, kind of in the same way that, maybe Saudi Arabia violates human rights, but they're an American ally, so we accept them anyway. That's not the sort of debate we should be having about India.